Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's NeoSystems CMMC Town Hall. Now I'd like to introduce your host, Ed Bassett from NeoSystems. Ed?
Thanks, Don. Welcome, everybody, to our continuing series of Town Hall Ask Me Anything sessions on the cybersecurity maturity model certification. We've been doing these for about a year now on a weekly basis with a few breaks here and there. For those of you who've been to these before, I want to thank you for your attention, and I hope we keep it interesting for you. I hope we're bringing you good information that helps you with your cybersecurity decisions. My guest today, Robert Metzger. I want to mention to everyone that we are recording these sessions as part of our community outreach to the Defense Industrial Base. Our focus at NeoSystems as a managed service provider is on organizations that are seeking certification under CMMC. If you're in the audience today and you have some questions for Mr. Metzger, please put those in the Q&A function within Zoom, and I'll try to work those questions into the conversation in the next 30 minutes. I'll start with the introduction of Bob Metzger. Bob heads the DC office of the law firm Rogers, Joseph & O'Donnell. It's a litigation boutique specializing in government contracting. He advises leading companies in the aerospace and defense and IT sector on matters including litigation, contract award controversies, national security matters, and regulatory compliance. Bob is also the co-author of MITRE's Deliver Uncompromised report, which was released in 2018 and is really one of the initial sparks that led to the CMMC program that we have today. Bob also served on the Defense Science Board task force that produced the 2017 Cyber Supply Chain Report. So his perspective on supply chain risks, in particular due to cyber threats, very well informed, and applies that to his client base today. Today, we're going to explore some of his insights on these risks and how we can address them. So Bob, thanks for joining us today.
Well, thank you. I've really admired the series that NeoSystems has put on. It's my privilege to be here, and I hope that I'm able to shed a little light onto the many questions that exist.
Well, thanks. Let's start with maybe the broader picture. CMMC is just one piece of this larger cybersecurity picture. Some people have pointed out on this series and others that CMMC would not have prevented SolarWinds hack, for example, that caused a lot of damage. What's your view on kind of the larger supply chain risk issues and how CMMC fits into that picture?
Well, it's a great question. We've seen a number of events recently that have shown us that the threats that adversaries deliver are different in vector or method and in consequence than where CMMC is focused. My take on CMMC is that it extends the present DFARS and 171 regime, which are focused upon the protection of a network perimeter that tend to look towards the security of on-premises systems and which have the principal goal of protecting the confidentiality of certain types of information, CUI. And the objective we're trying to achieve is to prevent the exfiltration or loss or diversion of sensitive information, CUI or intellectual property. Those are all important. But adversaries have other vectors to pursue and other methods to pursue and other consequences that can follow. So SolarWinds is an example of a supply chain delivered attack. It illustrates to us that supply chain attacks can come not just through cyber IT or network connection, but they can come through even trusted sources, and they can come in ways where the national origin of the attack is disguised by having a facilitating U.S. Infrastructure. Other areas of supply chain vulnerability, which can have physical or cyber consequences, include cyber OT against manufacturing or operational technology. They include firmware, software, of course, as well as hardware. And we have to be thinking as well, even about vulnerabilities to our sources of material and their quality, and to the logistics organizations that we employ to stage and deliver our goods and services. And if that were not enough, we have to be thinking about the risk that adversaries will use what they learn about our workforce and methods of social manipulation to subvert or potentially to turn employees into insider threats. That's a huge span of challenges and problems. I wish that I were, just speculating about things that might occur and worrying about possibilities that won't happen. But every aspect of what I just discussed is in the real world. And we've had recent, almost weekly, painful examples of these problems. Now, while I think CMMC, has many values, and it certainly has propelled the industry to get smarter and to work more, it covers only a portion of that broader threat landscape. And we're going to need to think about ways in which industry can concentrate its resources, human, technical, and financial, to get the most effective result accomplished against the broad reach of these threats. And it could be that we might want to change the relative priority of CMMC and information confidentiality protection, so that we don't spend too much resources sort of on one thing and neglect other things that could actually have more consequence.
Good advice for sure. CMMC has, as you say, has been getting people's attention. It's turning a lot of heads. It's causing some people to do things in a different way than they were, year and a half ago. We've been doing these town hall sessions for a year, I mentioned, as we track this forward. So it's definitely complex. It is taking up brain cycles, is taking up attention, money, from members of the DIB. But we're seeing a lot of forward progress by the DIB, by the marketplace that serves them with IT products and services. So I kind of want to ask you, how does where we are now and what's going on with CMMC compare to what was envisioned at the time you were putting Deliver Uncompromised together? At that time, you're identifying challenges, recommending some solutions that sparked this, among other things. How does that compare, what we are doing now, to what you had envisioned back then?
Well, that's a great question. For better or for worse, I have some fingerprints on CMMC, because some of the ideas in the Deliver Uncompromised report can be seen in what followed. Our principal concern at the time was that the self-attestation of contractors as to the adequacy of their security, when subject to the 7012 contract clause, was just not working. The rate of exfiltration or theft, successful espionage of controlled and classified information, was doing huge damage to national security as well as to enterprise value. So we said self-attestation, it's not working. We need to go to a path where we have assessments, and where the government expects and indeed requires that companies actually have security at certain levels, in order for the government to have confidence that if they buy from those companies, they won't find that the products, services, or technologies are already compromised by the time of delivery. Compromised in this sense means that your adversary already knows what it is you've done, or is working to mimic what you've accomplished by reason of that exfiltration or theft. Well, okay, a lot of that is present. There was actually, in the Deliver Uncompromised report, 10 measures that concerned, how we would go about moving from self-attestation to an assessed approach. And a fair number of those things are accomplished, some rather differently than we expected. We said at the time we need to require minimum security measures. Well, that's kind of being done. And we said that we can't trust companies to just say they're doing it. We need to come up with a way to review and assess. Well, we're doing that too. We also said that the Department of Defense should work with industry to establish metrics for enterprise level accreditation using expert third parties. Well, we're kind of doing that, Ed. I mean, we have the accreditation body, volunteers who have put a huge amount of effort into creating an assessment mechanism in an accreditation body. And I have tremendous regard for their hard work and appreciation for what they've accomplished. And I know that a lot of companies have invested in being part of that ecosystem. But it always has struck me as a little bit peculiar that we are creating out of whole cloth an all new method, all new infrastructure for assessment and accreditation, whereas there already are, other entities who are very capable of and have their own regimes established for assessment, certification, and accreditation. And as I look at CMMC on the ground now, what I see is that the scale of CMMC's requirements, potentially reaching 20, 30, or 1,000 or more companies for that level 3, it's extremely big. And we're finding that that there's this funnel of the availability of accredited assessors, which is extremely small. We're not going to be able to achieve the objectives of CMMC unless we find a way to make the assessment and accreditation validation mechanism kind of fit the scale of the industry to be affected. We can't have assessors be the rate limiting or progress stopping problem. So that's why I would hope that we would start to see some ways that the AB might reach out and seem to try to partner or affiliate with or act as a point of coordination, maybe even control over other existing entities. I'm just going to mention high trust as an example, so that we can deal with that resource problem. Now, there are a couple of things that we had in our recommendations that we haven't really gotten to at all. We thought that DoD should start to use security as an evaluation factor. Well, that really hasn't been done very much. So everybody on this call knows that you're supposed to take your DoD self-assessment against 171 and you put it in SPURS. Well, SPURS is something that's available to the government when it's buying from you. And SPURS is something that a contracting officer can use to assess your responsibility to do the work. But SPURS is really only useful at the prime contract level. And so far as I know, there's no established mechanism for DoD to consider your actual score on SPURS in deciding whether you get more or less evaluation credit. It's instead this sort of, are you responsible, are you not? So that's something that hasn't really happened. And maybe DoD should be thinking of ways in which it can actually look beyond the score to the actual security and give some credit where it's been earned, maybe. I know that raises competitive issues and potential protests. We also were concerned back then, Ed, that we look at software assurance, that we consider methods of kind of establishing standards of due care, that is the minimum contractors have to do in their overall security accomplishment. We wanted to encourage safe harbors so that people would do a better job faster of making disclosures of breaches or the discovery of vulnerability. And we haven't really gotten that done. So it's sort of a mixed picture. A fair number of the important objectives of the Deliver Uncompromised report are being accomplished. We've learned some lessons, few of them painful, as to the need to adjust some of the measures. We've got a long way to go. I hate to use that phrase, it's a journey, but this is a long journey with a lot of twists and turns and occasional diversions and detours. But we're all on it, and we're never going to reach the destination, because there is no such thing as perfect security of an enduring character that lets you rest comfortably. It will never happen.
Very true. So you mentioned that the original impetus was that the self-attestation was not working, meaning there's a regulation in place that required people to do things and they simply weren't doing them for various reasons, right? Missed differences in interpretation, maybe misunderstanding what they were supposed to do and what systems it applied to, those kind of things, all kinds of reasons why self-attestation wasn't working. So CMMC really at the top level is sort of doubling down on those regulations that were already there, right? The level 1 mimics the FAR clauses that were already in place. Level 3 mimics the DFAR 7012 clause that was already in place that requires 800-171. So level 4 and 5 does involve some new requirements that didn't exist before, but in large part, it's really doubling down on enforcement of those existing regulations, with a big addition, I guess, of maturity, meaning that we want to not just see that you passed an audit, but we want to see that you're going to do this, before, during, and after. So what do you feel about, did they capture the right piece of it, right? Was this just about,
I think they captured too much of it, Ed.
What's that?
They captured too much.
Okay.
Right. I mean, there's an idealized element to the CMMC maturity model and to the articulation of the program and the present plans as expressed by its leadership. There's this idea that we're going to take on 20,000 companies and do assessments and require certifications for maturity level 3. And then we're going to take on another 300,000 just to make sure that they properly protect federal contract information. Well, you got to be sensitive to, let's call it the value proposition. You have a finite amount of resources, human, technical, and financial. You have a diverse array of problems. You want to be sensitive to whether the theory that you've articulated and the methods that you employ to pursue that theory are going to produce results that are proportionate or commensurate to the investment and that actually achieve the central purposes of the exercise. And here I think there are rooms for adjustment. You mentioned level 1. Well, I understand the reason that federal contract information should be protected, and there's even stuff in the MITRE report about how we shouldn't be so generous in making information about our procurements available to anybody who wants to look. I get it. And I'm very much aware of levels 4 and 5. I understand something about advanced persistent threats. SolarWinds would be an example of same. And I know that, for high value assets and sensitive defense programs, the controls of 171 just don't do it. And in fact, everybody else knows that too, since we now have a special publication 172 and the new assessment methods for that in 172A. Well, we got to kind of, focus on the realistic and the achievable, rather than the theoretical and the ideal. And I think we've got some problems. So, I look at this and say that the part of our industry that's most at risk is that part of the defense industrial base that does work at level 3. In other words, the same group that's required to meet 171 now. I think we would do a huge amount if we could actually have confidence that say 20,000 companies really do satisfy not just 171, but those extra 20 mostly policies that are in CMMC maturity level 3. I think that would be a great accomplishment. Getting that done is going to be incredibly difficult. This is a complex machine with so many levers, gears, interconnects, and the like. And what we're finding is that if any part of it sort of goes wrong, if you don't have enough assessors, if they're behind schedule, if you don't have enough reviewers of the assessors, if you don't have enough companies and are not comfortable enough, they don't understand how much they have to cover or what they have to do. If anything goes wrong in the system, it doesn't work. Well, that's not the answer. So my approach to, is one of a bit of triage. I would postpone level 1 entirely until I have got level 3 figured out. I would basically remove level 2 as something to be concerned about at all. I've never quite understood why it's there, and I doubt anybody else does. Level 4 and level 5 are really important, but we're going to be following 172 and not maturity levels 4 and 5, because 172 is the product of a massive amount of work involving DoD, the IC, NIST, and other agencies, and that's what's going to kind of control the show. Moreover, if you are doing work that actually involves the protections of levels 4 or 5, you're already going to know it. You're going to be paid for it specifically by your customer. And I think we can deal with the level 4 and level 5 threats on a contract by contract basis with selective application of the principles from 172. What does this leave? Well, this leaves that core group, maybe 20,000 companies for level 3. One other thought. It's 20,000 companies is a huge amount of scale when you think of the resources that we have now to assess, or even the number of capable consultants we have to advise. That's a very large group. But what if, Ed, what if just 10% of those people that we are expecting to do level 1, what if they really think they are level 3? Or what if they want that certification for level 3 so that they'll be eligible to do level 3 business? Well, suddenly your 20,000 companies for level 2, already a very big mountain to climb, becomes 30,000 companies. You've just added 10% of the group you thought was at level 1. Well, you see the problem with scale. Scale is an issue. And as we're realizing that there's so many intricacies to making the CMMC initiative work, it's time to kind of, stop, pause, reflect. There was a hardware concept used in years past called test, analyze, and fix. Well, we got some experience on the ground now. We're getting to work on pilots. We got consultants who are out there. We're coming up with better tools. I think the leadership needs to kind of pause here and say, okay, what really matters to me? How much do I want companies to spend on this? What's the outcome I'm going to get? Am I going to get formalistic compliance at huge cost? But am I really going to protect the assets I need? Will I get the outcome in terms of in terms of exfiltration denial or exclusion of misuse of information, even if compromised? We have to be thinking that outcomes is not just getting that certification. The outcome you ultimately want is confidence that the valuable assets won't be stolen, that your operations won't be disrupted, and that you're resilient in the inevitable event that somebody gets through all of that and attacks you successfully. And one of the things I think is really missing is more recognition about resilience. It's key, and that's in the MITRE report. Sorry for the long answer, but I think I covered some use.
That was a good answer. Let me circle back a little bit on the, talking about scaling down and really focusing on the valuable assets and those companies, those 20 or so thousand that actually have some valuable assets. I talk to a lot of companies and they say, we don't know if we have any CUI. We don't think so, but our prime contractor is beating us up to submit a SPURS score. So we have to be compliant with 800-171. What exactly are you compliant with if you don't have any systems that are covered contractor information systems, right? So I guess to this race circle back on, what is CUI? And if you don't know you have any, are you protecting the right stuff? Do you have any valuable assets in your possession? I would say, if you have valuable assets, you ought to know it and you want to protect them. If you don't have valuable assets, that's a good thing to know too, right? Because again, in terms of allocating scarce resources, do we want to be spending a lot of resources protecting things that really aren't that valuable?
Well, I mean,
another
great, it's a great question, and we should set another half an hour aside for this.
Okay.
My views on CUI are a little bit controversial. I don't think that all CUI is created equally. I do think that I recognize that there are categories and subcategories of CUI in the NARA rule, and I've read it. And I view that CUI is essentially are various types of information which the government must protect because government law, regulation, or policy tell the government it has to protect them. We have this peculiarity in the 70-12 rule that sort of we've gone outside that boundary of things that the government has to protect and suddenly said you contractors have to protect some stuff as well. Fundamentally, I believe it's the government's job to identify CUI, to designate it, to tell you if you're using it, to tell you when you're supplying it. But I appreciate that the purposes of 70-12 and CMMC are broader and important. Those purposes are not just to protect that narrow category of information that has a distribution statement. Those purposes are to protect information which you do not want our adversaries to have, which you do not want to have compromised, which you do not want to have subject to ransomware, you do not want to have corrupted, you don't want to have denied. And we have to be thinking ultimately about kind of the end point of this. It is not to perfectly protect a small subset of information. It is to protect well a risk-informed portion of your information. Not everything that you have in an information system has the same consequence if it's exfiltrated. Not everything that you use to perform a contract has any particular nexus or functional importance to your DoD work. So, in my view, it's important to take a very careful and discriminating look at CUI. What I hear from my clients is a tendency to assume that anything and everything, which is of a character which might correspond to or look like or sound like one of those CUI regulatory, the NAR rule sets up these different categories and subcategories. Some people are looking at their inventory of information across the enterprise and they're saying, well, I have stuff that looks like that or could be this or could be that. Well, the fact that you have independent or information which you own and you created, which you never delivered to the government, which has no relationship to a government contract, which you will never export. The fact that it kind of looks like a CUI category does not make it CUI that is actually subject to this rule, in my view. So I keep thinking about, let's call it outcomes. What is the information in my possession which I use where if it were lost, it would do harm to the government and do harm to the value of my enterprise because a business rival or adversary would have the knowledge of my IP. That's the information that I would concentrate upon. And I think it's important for the government to help us get some boundaries or give us more authority to set those boundaries so that we don't get every company's having its own different idea of what is CUI, so that we don't have companies over designating stuff as CUI and changing their whole organizations or spending a fortune to protect stuff that doesn't matter. We have both the risk that you described, Ed, of protecting too little. That's bad. And we have the other risk that I've seen at scale, which is companies saying, oh my gosh, everything that I've acquired and keep historically across the entire range of my enterprise globally could be CUI, I have to protect it. Neither of those are right. We got to have a kind of risk-informed, outcome-influenced approach to this, I believe.
We'll work in a couple of audience questions related to that thread. This one is, based on FCI being unmarked and contracting officers' understanding of how to protect information, everything will be marked CUI or marked as FOUO with guidance that all FOUO is CUI. So, tendency to overmark maybe is where he's getting at. So the number of level 3 will be way higher than estimated based on this user behavior. Do you see that happening? Do you see people kind of overblowing who needs to be in the level 3 category?
I know DoD is working hard on this, and people like Jeff Spinninger and others are putting a lot of effort in, and they're making progress to train their people at different levels and to do a better job of informing industry of when CUI or controlled technical information is present. But we still have a situation where designation can be done by a lot of people who are not so well trained and by a lot of higher tier contractors who may not be trained at all. It's taken years for the federal government to be figuring out how to deal with CUI for its own sake. And let's appreciate that in certain respects, you know, this control of CUI and FCI, in some respects, it kind of derives from or is a smaller scale representation of how we designate and protect classified information. That took decades to accomplish, and it requires a huge and expensive infrastructure to sustain. Well, we don't have that infrastructure, and we haven't taken decades. So the short answer is this: just because it's marked, well, if it has a distribution statement, I think you've got to assume that it is CUI, because and if that happens, going to the government and trying to get a different answer isn't going to happen. So you got to deal with it. If it says it's a distribution statement B through F, it is. FUO, that's not a CUI category. That's people trying to evade their responsibilities under the CUI rule. I do see examples of over-designation. It's important to try to avert those, but it puts companies in a difficult situation. If you get something where you don't think it's properly been marked and you choose to ignore it, and then it gets compromised, and then somebody says, why didn't you protect it? And your answer is, oh, well, I disagreed with your interpretation. Well, it might work, but it's likely to lead to some contest at the least.
One more CUI question, and then I'm going to circle back with a sort of assessment scale question, and then I'll kind of wrap things up for today. This question is, why are the government agencies having such a hard time properly marking and informing contractors of CUI and other unclassified controlled data? Contractors overreact because they don't want to be caught accidentally releasing controlled information, even in pieces that could be later combined to the CUI. Makes sense. So yeah, why is this challenging for the government? What's the hard part of this?
I'm not entirely sure, but you know, I think we all have this tendency when there can be consequences, adverse consequences to doing too little. You know, the natural tendency of people is to say, well, I'm not sure, but if I over designate or over spec or over require, I'm probably not going to be criticized, as opposed to forbearing from designation and then finding out years later that I made a terrible mistake. And that some of that is, we could call it the compliance mentality. You know, when in doubt, do more to comply. Well, I respect that. And as a lawyer, I'm always telling my clients that you have to comply. But I want to come back to this higher level equation. Government, as well as industry, needs to be risk informed, and they need to be thinking about the outcome. You know, it really isn't a good idea to spend more resources than you have to achieve outcomes that are diluted. In other words, if you overspend for things that don't matter or overprotect stuff that isn't consequential, that means that you're going to expend that finite pool of resources on stuff that really doesn't help you. And we have so many real cybersecurity and supply chain challenges. It's important to adjust this so that companies make the right decision on how to spend their money, time, and talent, and not the wrong decision just because of overexpansive definitions.
Agreed. One last audience question, then I'll ask a wrap-up question that'll close us out. This goes to your comment earlier about the need to scale. You mentioned high trust. So this audience member says, hey, DCMA was originally designated as the agency for verification of cybersecurity compliance and never got the job done. Now, independent certifiers are not readily available. Wouldn't it be more productive to make cybersecurity compliance part of ISO compliance and depend on the many available ISO certifiers?
I think that's an idea that merits further exploration. There's a lot to like in this special publication 800-171, and it's been adjusted over time, but it's not exactly a new standard while threats, vulnerabilities, and responses have changed. And so you can ask yourself, gee, what is it? Why is it that we're kind of lashed to 171 and its extension to maturity level 3? And why is it that I want to go at this a different way. I'm sort of getting off on a bit of a diversion. I can understand why we'd want to improve 171, and that's why maybe we have CMMC maturity level 3. And I can appreciate the utility of having a different approach to assessment that is particularized to CMMC and DoD's unique needs. But what we're finding is that we're creating this unique infrastructure for this very difficult purpose and ignoring all of the other resources, standards, and practices that have similar purposes and are already achieved by others. And if part of our problem now is that we can't get enough assessment through the funnel of assessors and their accreditation, well, we've got to be looking to expand that funnel. We've got to be looking to other standards, taking reciprocity at a larger scale. What else could we look to? What can we look to at ISO? What can we look to for other assessment and accreditation means? How can we partner with them rather than exclude them? Why create a unique federal mechanism to do this?
Agreed. There are a lot of things out there that the reciprocity has been talked about, bounced around. And if the goal is better cyber hygiene, maybe strict compliance is less important than leveraging anything we have at our disposal that raises the bar.
Can I jump in on that right now? The
Yeah.
single most important thing that must change, and I've said this forever, is the 100% rule. I understand the theory perfectly. Everybody already is attested that they're conforming to 171, and therefore you should have no open POAMs, and you should be able to meet those additional 20 things. And if you want a certificate, you've got to be perfect, and you've had plenty of time, and we've told you to be ready. That's great. But in the real world, it doesn't work. And what it does is it, instead of making CMMC an incentive or a motivator for companies to do better, it becomes that and a trap. And if you fall through that trap, there are very bad consequences, not just to you, the company you can't bid on new work or can't perform on existing contracts when they're modded or extended. The trap actually injures those others in your supply chain. If you're a prime contractor, you have 150 suppliers, and 2 of them fail, you might not even be able to perform the prime contract for which you are the only and decisively necessary supplier. You may not be able to get anybody else. And so this perfect, rule of perfection, no POAMs, I think that it has, pragmatic consequences that are intolerable. And if I were a requiring activity or a program office at DoD, I would not be happy to hear that I can't buy this or sustain that or improve the next thing because 1 or 2 pieces of a complex supply chain are 5 or 10 or 15 requirements short. I don't want it. I want everybody to be fully compliant, but the requiring activity ought to have some ability to do a risk assessment and make a risk-informed judgment of what I am willing to accept. So I think we need to have some play in the joints. And we have to kind of get away from this idea that you're going to fall through the trap door if you can't get through your certification at 100% the first time. And also, let's not forget this idea that you get a 100% score and you're good for 3 years. Well, I mean, new threats emerge every day. There's new CWEs and CVEs every day. You can find things out about yourself tomorrow that you had no idea existed today. In the moment that you learn something about a vulnerability that is 0 day to you, and wasn't known when you got your certificate, well, suddenly you don't have 100% because you have something to fix. So let's get realistic. Let's, be agile. Let's not take, this idealized approach to adequacy, turn it into perfection. When in the actual world of security, perfection is a goal you should always seek, but you will never actually achieve or sustain. Got to keep working at it, but don't ever get to a point where you can say, aha, wrap me in a box, put a ribbon around me, give me a gold certificate, and I'm good to go. I don't think it works that way.
Well, Bob, as a practitioner, I'll say that, when you get your SPUR score up to 105 or 100, those last couple things are probably holding out for a reason. They're probably on the wrong side of the diminishing returns curve, and it's probably not a good use of funds to go pursue those. But, there's a mandate to do so. Sometimes there's a reason. Sometimes people are just being lazy, but often it's a risk-informed decision to keep those things on the POAM because they just don't make sense. So I think that definitely.
Well, I mean, you don't want POAMs to be a license for indifference or neglect. Can't have that.
Certainly true.
So if we're going to have CMMC set a high standard, which it should, we should expect people to get it all done. And we should have tight constraints on how long they might be a little short of 100%. We also have to put some play in the joints, because not all of the assessors are going to look at the same practices with the same eye and reach the same result. And every company is different. And so the circumstances of a company that lead to one practice control or technique, might mean that at the next company, something different is also permissible, but not the same as what the assessor saw the last time. So we gotta be agile and responsive. We've got to be learning as we go. We don't want to set up these hard gates and that become, laudable objectives, but cliffs, where the unwary fall. Not a good plan.
Agreed. We are kind of over our 30-minute time, so I want to thank you for your insights here today. Thank the audience members for sending in some great questions. Please do join us for future town hall sessions. Our next session is going to be next Wednesday, May 19th at 1 p.m. Eastern. Amy Holland is going to be back, and she's going to talk about her experience going through a DIVCAC audit when she was at Perspecta. Give us the inside track on how those audits are performed, what to expect, how to be prepared, how to be successful. So some practical experience there. For many of us, the number of DIVCAC audits is fairly small, but they're happening now, where CMMC is still out in the future. So there's a bunch of us that are going to experience that before we have a CMMC audit. And I think the lessons learned there are applicable to those who end up with CMMC audit being their first experience with somebody looking at their cybersecurity posture. So that should be an interesting session next week. If you don't have the registration information, please visit our website, neosystemscorp.com, for those details. Thanks very much, everybody. Thanks, Bob. Thanks, audience.
Thank you.